He was 17 years old when his own brothers sold him for the price of a pair of sandals, 20 pieces of silver. That's what they decided he was worth. A father's favorite son, thrown into a pit and sold to slave traders, heading to Egypt. But here's what will wreck you about this story. 13 years later, those same brothers would bow before him, begging for mercy, and he'd have the power to either save them or destroy them. Joseph's story isn't about a perfect life. It's about what happens when everything you thought God promised you gets stripped away, when the people closest to you become your greatest enemies, when you do the right thing and lose everything anyway. And if you're in a season right now where you've been betrayed, forgotten, or wondering if God even remembers your name, what you're about to discover in the next hour might completely change how you see your current circumstances. By the end, you'll understand why the pit was never your punishment. It was your preparation, and why the people who tried to destroy you might actually be part of the plan to deliver you. Joseph's journey spans 13 years of absolute heartbreak, sold into slavery by his own family, falsely accused of assault, thrown into prison for a crime he didn't commit, forgotten by the one person who promised to remember him. Yet he emerges as the second most powerful man in the ancient world, saving millions of lives from starvation, including the lives of the brothers who betrayed him. The book of Genesis doesn't tell us Joseph's story to inspire us with a feel-good rags-to-riches tale. It shows us something far more profound, how God moves in the hidden places of our lives, especially when we're invisible to everyone else, how your greatest setback can become your greatest setup, how the wound you thought would kill you can become the wisdom that heals others. We're about to unpack 43 bite-sized principles that can transform not just how you see your circumstances, but who you become in the middle of them. Some of these lessons will comfort you, others will confront you, but all of them will show you what it looks like to live with absolute faith in God when life is absolutely uncertain. What Joseph learned in the darkness is about to illuminate something in your own story. Lesson 1. Your dreams are God's preview of your future, not your present reality. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. Genesis 37 verse 5-7. Joseph had visions of his future, sheaves of grain bowing down to his sheaf, the sun, moon, and 11 stars bowing down to him. These weren't just random dreams. They were prophetic downloads about where God was taking him. His brothers weren't impressed. In fact, they were furious. Even his father rebuked him for the audacity of it. But catch this detail. Joseph didn't dismiss what he sensed God was showing him just because it made people uncomfortable. He didn't edit his vision to make it more palatable. He didn't shrink his dream to fit their expectations. Your God-given dreams matter. Not because they'll make you popular, not because everyone will understand them. They matter because they're often God's way of anchoring you to your future when your present circumstances try to convince you there is no future. Here's what trips us up. We share our visions with people who are intimidated by them, then feel crushed when they mock what we sense God calling us toward. We take their rejection as evidence that we heard wrong. But sometimes, rejection is confirmation. Do this today. Write down what God has shown you about your future, not to prove it to anyone else, but to create an anchor for yourself. In a journal, on your phone, somewhere you can return to when everything falls apart. You're going to need that anchor more than you realize. What happens next in Joseph's life will test this conviction in ways he never imagined. Lesson 2. The intensity of opposition often reveals the significance of your assignment. His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more. Genesis 37 verse 8. The more Joseph spoke about his destiny, the more his brothers resented him. But notice something crucial. Their jealousy wasn't random, it was surgical. They weren't angry at him for being lazy, dishonest, or disrespectful. They were angry at him because he represented something that challenged their position in the family hierarchy. When people oppose your vision, pay attention to what specifically triggers them. Often, It's because your calling threatens their comfort. That doesn't mean you're wrong. It might mean you're exactly right. The opposition Joseph faced from his own family wasn't a sign that he should abandon his dreams. It was a sign that those dreams were significant enough to provoke a reaction from the forces that benefit from the status quo. Here's the trap we fall into. We assume rejection means we've missed God's direction. We think if we were truly called, doors would open easily and people would celebrate us. But if everyone approves of your path, you might want to ask yourself whether that path actually requires faith. Ask yourself, what aspect of your calling triggers the most resistance from people around you? That might be exactly where God is calling you to lean in, not back off. This opposition is about to intensify in a way that will push Joseph to the breaking point. Lesson 3. The deepest betrayal often comes from the people who should protect you most. When they saw him from a distance, before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. They lifted Joseph out of the pit and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelite traders. Genesis 37, verse 18 and 28. His brothers didn't just reject Joseph's dreams, they tried to murder him. Then, when Reuben convinced them to spare his life, they settled on something arguably worse, selling him into slavery. For profit. Let that sink in. The people who shared his childhood, who ate at the same table, who knew his vulnerabilities and fears, they made a calculated business decision to remove him from their lives because his presence was inconvenient to them. They sold their own brother for 20 pieces of silver, about the price of a pair of sandals in that economy. Betrayal by strangers stings. Betrayal by family changes your DNA. Joseph's brothers didn't accidentally hurt him. There was no misunderstanding, no miscommunication. They saw an opportunity and they took it. They watched him plead for his life from the bottom of that pit, and they sat down to eat lunch while deciding his fate. The instinct when you experience this level of betrayal is to either become bitter or to broadcast your pain to anyone who'll listen. You want people to know what was done to you. You want vindication, justice, acknowledgement. Watch what Joseph does. Nothing. He doesn't plot revenge. He doesn't spend his life rehearsing the story of his victimhood. He moves forward. And that single decision, to refuse bitterness, separates people who overcome from people who get stuck in their trauma. Remember, when you're betrayed, the person who hurt you gets to move on immediately. You're the one left holding the pain. Bitterness is when you keep holding it, thinking somehow it punishes them. It doesn't. It only imprisons you. What Joseph couldn't know in that moment was that this pit of betrayal was actually the doorway to his deliverance. If you're still with me, we're about to watch something powerful unfold, because the pit Joseph was thrown into, it wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning. The brothers thought they were writing Joseph's ending, but they were actually scripting his elevation. If you've been betrayed, underestimated, or discarded by people who mattered to you, stay with me, because what happens next reveals how God operates when everyone else has given up on you. Lesson 4. Your current assignment, no matter how small, is your audition for your next one. The Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Potiphar put Joseph in charge of his household. Genesis 39, verse 2-3. Joseph was sold as a slave. Everything about his situation screamed injustice and punishment. But instead of falling into despair or resentment, Joseph worked. He took his current assignment, being a slave, and brought excellence to it. He didn't do the minimum and count the days until something better came along. He served Potiphar's household as if it mattered. And his master noticed. More importantly, God noticed. Here's the principle that will transform your life if you let it. You cannot skip levels in God's kingdom. Joseph had to be faithful in Potiphar's house before he could be faithful as a ruler over Egypt. He had to learn how to lead servants before he could lead a nation. The pit prepared him for the palace, but the palace required preparation. We constantly think our current role is beneath us. We're waiting for the big opportunity, the real break, the position that actually matters. Meanwhile, God is watching how we handle what's in front of us right now. I learned this the hard way. Early in ministry, I resented small opportunities. I wanted to speak to thousands, but God kept giving me rooms of 12. I thought I was ready for more, but I was performing in the small rooms instead of serving in them. The moment I shifted, when I started treating those 12 people like they were the most important audience in the world, everything changed. Not because God suddenly decided to promote me, because I finally became worthy of promotion. Do this today. Identify one task in your current role that you've been doing half-heartedly because it feels beneath you. This week, do that task with the same excellence you'd bring if your dream boss was watching. Watch what shifts. This mindset is about to sustain Joseph through something far more difficult than slavery. Lesson 5. Your integrity is the only currency that holds value when everything else is stripped away. After a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph, but he refused. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? Genesis 39, verse 7 to 12. Potiphar's wife wanted Joseph. She had power, position, and persistence. She could have offered him comfort, advancement, even freedom eventually. Day after day, she propositioned him. And day after day, Joseph refused. Then one day, she caught him alone. She grabbed his cloak. She made her demand explicit. And Joseph ran. He didn't negotiate. He didn't debate the ethics. He didn't think, well, maybe just this once. He understood that some things cost more than comfort. Some things cost more than advancement. His integrity was worth more than a promotion that came at the expense of his character. This is the exact opposite of how our world operates. We're constantly told to compromise a little here, bend the rules a little there, do whatever it takes to get ahead, sleep with the right people, lie on your resume, cheat on your taxes. Everyone does it. You're a fool if you don't. But Joseph understood something foundational. Your character is the only currency that keeps its value when everything else is taken from you. When you lose your job, when you lose your money, when you lose your reputation, your integrity is what remains, and it becomes the foundation for everything God rebuilds in your life. Ask yourself, is there an area where you're compromising for advancement? What would it cost you to maintain integrity there, and what would losing your integrity cost your future? Joseph's faithfulness to God in this moment is about to cost him his freedom, and that's where this lesson gets brutal. Lesson 6. Doing the right thing doesn't always lead to immediate reward. Sometimes it leads to greater testing. When his master heard the story, his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me." His anger burned. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, where the king's prisoners were confined. Genesis 39, verse 19 to 20. Joseph was thrown into prison, not because he did anything wrong, but because he refused to do something wrong. He was punished for his faithfulness. Let that paradox sit with you for a moment. Here's what catches most of us. We assume that righteous living should lead to comfortable circumstances. We operate with this transaction in our minds. If I do the right thing, God owes me open doors and smooth paths. But that's not what happened to Joseph. He maintained his integrity and lost his freedom. He honored God and ended up in a cell. This is where most people abandon their values. We hold integrity loosely, willing to trade it for comfort if the price is right. We assume God's favor looks like blessing, so when we're faithful and things get worse, we think we've been abandoned. But Joseph understood something deeper. He wasn't righteous because he expected it to work out well. He was righteous because it was who he was called to be, regardless of outcome. The reward wasn't the point. The relationship with God was the point. Remember, don't maintain your integrity as a transaction with God, hoping for immediate rewards. Maintain it because it's the foundation of who you are. The rewards will come, but not always when or how you expect them. Yet something remarkable happens in that prison. Joseph's character doesn't erode. It deepens. Lesson 7. Your character develops in darkness, not in daylight. The Lord was with Joseph and showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. Soon the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison and had him oversee all that was done there. Genesis 39 verse 21 to 23. Even in prison, even after being betrayed by his brothers and falsely accused by Potiphar's wife, Joseph didn't become bitter. He didn't become difficult or vengeful. He continued to bring excellence to whatever was in front of him, even when what was in front of him was a prison cell. The warden saw something in Joseph that transcended his circumstances, and instead of Joseph remaining just another prisoner, he ended up managing the entire prison operation. Here's the pattern we're starting to see. Joseph's character wasn't formed in comfort, it was forged in adversity. The qualities that made him trustworthy, the traits that later made him a great leader, none of those were developed when life was easy. They were developed in the dungeon. We constantly think character is demonstrated by what we do when everything is going well, but your real character is revealed by what you do when everything is falling apart. Anyone can be kind when life is pleasant. Anyone can maintain integrity when they're being rewarded, but to stay faithful when you've been unjustly imprisoned for something you didn't do, that requires a connection to God that goes beyond circumstances. Do this today. Identify the most frustrating circumstance in your life right now. Instead of asking God to remove it, ask Him what He's developing in you through it. Write down what you sense Him saying. Joseph is about to encounter two people in prison who will become the bridge between his captivity and his breakthrough. But first, he's going to have to wait longer than he ever imagined. This is where most people give up. This is where the dream starts to feel like a lie, and faithfulness starts to feel like foolishness. But watch what Joseph does in this forgotten season. Because what happens next will show you how to position yourself so that when the door finally opens, you're ready to walk through it. Lesson 8. God often uses unlikely people in unexpected places to open doors for you. Each of the two men had a dream. Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." Genesis 40 verse 5 to 8. In prison, Joseph met two men who seemed insignificant at the time, Pharaoh's chief cupbearer and chief baker. They had troubling dreams. Joseph offered to interpret them, not for payment, not for recognition, but because he had a gift, and he was willing to use it to help people in need. The cupbearer's dream came true exactly as Joseph predicted, restoration to his position. The baker's dream came true as well, execution. Joseph's accuracy was 100%. These two men became crucial to Joseph's story, but not in the way you'd expect. The cupbearer would eventually stand before Pharaoh, and years later, when Pharaoh had a dream that no one could interpret, the cupbearer would remember this young Hebrew prisoner who understood the language of dreams. That seemingly random act of kindness in prison, that was the bridge between Joseph's captivity and his breakthrough. Here's what we miss. We think our breakthroughs will come through obvious channels, important people, people with authority and resources. But sometimes God uses the overlooked people, the people in prison with us, the people we help when we have nothing to gain. That kindness comes back around in ways you never expected. Remember, be kind to everyone, especially when you have nothing to gain from it. You don't know which conversation is building the bridge to your next season. But there's a catch. Joseph has to wait. And that waiting is going to require a level of faith he hasn't needed yet. Lesson 9. Patience in the forgotten season is your final exam before promotion. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. Genesis 40 verse 23. Joseph interpreted the cupbearer's dream. The dream came true. Joseph asked the cupbearer to remember him, to mention him to Pharaoh. "Please, when you get out of here, tell the king about me." And the cupbearer forgot him. For 2 more years. 730 days of waking up in that prison cell, wondering if anyone outside those walls even remembered his name. 730 days of watching the door, hoping today would be the day someone came for him. 730 days of silence. Joseph didn't fall apart. He didn't lose faith. He didn't become bitter toward the man he had helped. He simply continued being who he was, faithful, diligent, trusting. The instinct we all have in this season is to force something to happen. We want to remind people we exist. We want to manufacture our breakthrough. We assume that if we helped someone, they owe us. But when people forget us, when our kindness isn't returned, when our help isn't acknowledged, we feel entitled to resentment. Joseph didn't operate that way. He understood that his faithfulness wasn't conditional on being remembered. It wasn't dependent on people following through. It was rooted in something deeper, a conviction that God's timing was better than his own. For 2 years, Joseph waited in obscurity, and in that waiting, he became the kind of person God could trust with a nation. Ask yourself, what are you waiting for right now? Instead of asking God, when? Ask him, who are you making me become while I wait? And then, suddenly, everything changes in a single night. Lesson 10, your breakthrough will arrive without warning. Be ready. When 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. No one could interpret his dreams for Pharaoh. Genesis 41, verse 1-8. Pharaoh had a troubling dream. He called all his wise men, all his magicians, all the people with impressive credentials and prestigious titles. None of them could help him. The most educated minds in Egypt stood before the most powerful man in the world, and they had nothing. In that moment of national crisis, the cupbearer's memory suddenly activated. Wait, I just remembered. 2 years ago, there was this young Hebrew in prison. Joseph had been in that cell for years. He had no idea that his breakthrough was about to happen. No notification, no warning, no divine memo saying, "Get ready, tomorrow's your day." It just arrived. And when it did, he had to be ready immediately. This is exactly how God's timing works. We spend enormous energy trying to create our own opportunities, trying to force doors open, trying to manufacture our breakthrough. But sometimes your moment is waiting for the perfect convergence, the right person, the right crisis, the right divine appointment. And it will show up when you least expect it, often years after you've given up calculating when it might come. Here's what you need to do today. Stop asking God when your breakthrough will come. Instead, ask, am I the kind of person who's ready when it does? Then identify one area where you need to develop before that door opens. Joseph is about to step before the most powerful man in Egypt, but first, he has to do something that reveals his level of wisdom. Lesson 11. How you prepare for your moment matters as much as the moment itself. Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, he was brought to Pharaoh. Genesis 41 verse 14. Joseph had been in prison for years. He was probably dirty, unkempt, marked by captivity. But when the message came that Pharaoh wanted to see him, Joseph didn't rush into the palace looking like a victim. He shaved, he changed his clothes, he composed himself. He didn't go before the king looking like a prisoner. He presented himself with dignity. This seems like a minor detail, but it's actually crucial. Joseph understood that how you present yourself affects how people receive your message. Not because appearance determines your worth, but because it affects their willingness to listen. If Joseph had shuffled before Pharaoh looking broken and desperate, Pharaoh might have dismissed him before he even spoke. But Joseph presented himself as someone who understood the weight of the moment. Here's the balance. Joseph took care of his external presentation, but he didn't place his confidence in how he looked. He walked before Pharaoh with something far more important, certainty that God had prepared him for exactly this moment. Here's what I want you to do. Look at your life right now. If your breakthrough happened tomorrow, would you be ready? Not just spiritually or mentally, but practically. Clean up whatever needs cleaning up. Be ready. Now Joseph is about to speak to the most powerful man he's ever encountered. Watch what he does with this opportunity. Lesson 12. Always point to the source of your power, not to yourself. Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I had a dream, and no one can interpret it." But I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. I cannot do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh. But God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. Genesis 41, verse 15 to 16. Pharaoh was already impressed with Joseph before Joseph even opened his mouth. The cupbearer had hyped him up. The setup was perfect for Joseph to take credit, to accept the admiration, to let the king believe this young Hebrew possessed some kind of magical power. But Joseph's first words were, "I cannot do it." He immediately deflected. He made it crystal clear that the power didn't come from him, but God will give you the answer. In that single moment, Joseph established his credibility not by claiming power, but by clarifying its source. This is rare. The instinct, when given an opportunity to impress someone important, is to milk that moment, to accept the praise, to let people think we're the source of the wisdom. But Joseph understood something fundamental. Your influence is only as strong and lasting as your connection to the source of that influence. The moment you take credit for what God is doing, you start your decline. Always be clear about your dependence on God. Don't let people mistake your effectiveness for your own power. Point them toward the source, not toward yourself. Joseph is about to prove this isn't just empty theology. He's about to demonstrate exactly what God can do through a person who refuses to steal glory. You're about to watch the most dramatic transformation in Joseph's entire story. He's moved from favored son to slave to prisoner. And now he's standing before Pharaoh with an opportunity to either save a nation or be thrown back into obscurity. What happens in the next few minutes of conversation will determine the trajectory of the rest of his life and the lives of millions of people. Lesson 13. God reveals future crises to those who will prepare, not just panic. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, "The dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do." Genesis 41, verse 25 to 32. Joseph listened to Pharaoh's dream carefully. He didn't rush to interpretation. He didn't perform or grandstand. He simply explained what God had revealed. 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of devastating famine. This wasn't complicated theology or mysterious prophecy. It was clear, actionable information about what was coming. And Joseph delivered it straight. No drama, no embellishment, no attempt to make it sound more spiritual than it was. Pharaoh understood immediately. 7 good years, 7 catastrophic years. Prepare now or die later. We constantly overcomplicate God's guidance. We think it has to be mysterious or dramatic or shrouded in spiritual language. But often, God's direction is straightforward. He tells you what's coming. He gives you the information you need. What you do with that information determines everything. Joseph received the message clearly, but now he had to do something risky, something that could have gotten him thrown back into prison or worse. Ask yourself, what has God been clearly showing you about your future that you've been ignoring because it requires uncomfortable action now? Watch what Joseph does next. This move separates dreamers from leaders. Lesson 14. Don't just identify problems, come with solutions. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 good years. Let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh. Genesis 41 verse 33 to 36. Joseph didn't just interpret Pharaoh's dream and stop there. He took a massive risk. He spoke up with a detailed solution. Here's exactly what needs to happen. Appoint commissioners. Tax 20% of the harvest during the good years. Store it in every city. Create a centralized grain reserve. When the famine hits, you'll have enough to survive and enough to sell to other nations. Joseph had zero authority to suggest policy to Pharaoh. He was a prisoner summoned to interpret a dream. His job was to deliver the message and shut up. But he understood something. The stakes were too high for silence. If he stayed quiet, millions of people would starve. So he spoke up with a clear, executable plan. The pattern we fall into is this: we see problems but don't speak up about solutions because we're afraid of overstepping. We're afraid of offending people with authority. We're afraid of being seen as presumptuous, but sometimes silence is complicity. Now, I want you to identify one problem you've been complaining about. Instead of just venting, develop one concrete solution and present it to someone with the authority to implement it. Pharaoh is about to make a decision that will alter Joseph's life forever. Lesson 15. Excellence plus humility plus wisdom equals unstoppable influence. Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders." Genesis 41 verse 39 to 41. From prisoner to prime minister in a single conversation. Pharaoh had options. He could have thanked Joseph for the interpretation, implemented the plan himself, and sent Joseph back to prison. But Pharaoh recognized something rare. This young man possessed wisdom that came from God. More than that, he had proven his trustworthiness through humility, his insight through clarity, and his capability through his track record in Potiphar's house and the prison. So Pharaoh entrusted him with everything. Joseph became the second most powerful person in all of Egypt. But notice the path he took to get there. Not through ambition, not through self-promotion, not through political maneuvering or strategic networking. He got there through faithfulness in obscurity, through maintaining his character in crisis, through giving credit to God instead of taking it for himself. This is the kingdom principle Joseph has been living his entire journey. You're promoted when you're ready, not when you're desperate. Stop trying to force promotion, focus on becoming worthy of it. Do the work in front of you with excellence. Let your character do the talking. Responsibility and authority will follow. Now Joseph is 30 years old. 13 years have passed since his brothers threw him in that pit. And he's about to face the exact crisis that God revealed to him through Pharaoh's dream. Everything he's been through has been preparation for this moment. Lesson 16. Revelation about the future is given so you can help others navigate it. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and Joseph went throughout the land of Egypt. He gathered up all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance. Genesis 41, verse 46 to 49. For 7 years, Joseph oversaw the collection and storage of grain. While everyone else was living in abundance, celebrating the harvests, enjoying the prosperity, Joseph was working. He was storing. He was preparing. The temptation when you receive authority and comfort is to settle in, enjoy the elevation, rest. But Joseph understood his assignment with crystal clarity. The famine is coming, and if I don't prepare during the years of abundance, people are going to starve. So Joseph stayed focused. He didn't get distracted by his new position or drunk on his power. He kept his eyes on the future and continued preparing for what was coming. This is the crucial principle for anyone who receives revelation from God. Information about the future isn't just so you know what's coming. It's so you can prepare and position yourself to help others when it arrives. In today's terms, think about financial crashes, pandemics, cultural shifts. If God shows you something is coming, your job isn't to panic or to hoard. It's to prepare wisely and position yourself to be a resource for others when the crisis hits. What is one thing you sense is coming in your industry, your community, or your life? What can you do now, in this season of relative abundance, to prepare for it? And then, exactly as Joseph predicted, the famine arrives. Everything he warned about becomes reality. Lesson 17. Your preparation in the invisible season becomes your platform in the visible season. The 7 years of abundance in Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. And all the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph, because the famine was severe everywhere. Genesis 41 verse 53 to 57. The famine came, and Egypt was ready. While other nations were starving, Egypt had stored grain, and people from everywhere, from every surrounding nation, came to Joseph to buy food. Joseph's wisdom saved Egypt. His preparation made him the most strategically important person in the world at that moment, not because he sought power, but because he was faithful to his calling. He had listened to God's guidance, he prepared accordingly, and when the crisis arrived, his preparation became his platform. We live our lives in obscurity, waiting for our moment to come. We think if we just get the platform, the visibility, the opportunity, then everything will change. But Joseph's life reveals something different. His moment became powerful because of what he did in the invisible season. The 13 years in slavery and prison, the 7 years of preparation in obscurity, that's what made him effective when everyone was watching. Don't wait for visibility to start doing important work. Do the important work in obscurity. When visibility comes, you'll be ready to steward it. But Joseph's story is about to take an unexpected turn, because guess who's about to show up in Egypt, desperate for food? Lesson 18. Your greatest test often comes after your greatest success. As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he treated them as strangers and spoke harshly to them. Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. Genesis 42 verse 7-8. 13 years after being sold into slavery, Joseph's brothers walked into his court, seeking grain. They didn't recognize him. He was dressed like an Egyptian. He spoke through an interpreter. He held absolute power over them. But Joseph recognized them immediately. In that moment, Joseph faced a test that had nothing to do with administration or leadership or resource management. This was a test of his heart. He could have revealed himself immediately and rushed to reconciliation, or he could have tested them to see what they had become. Had they changed? Had they grown? Or were they the same jealous, cruel men who sold him into slavery? Joseph chose to test them. He spoke harshly. He accused them of being spies. He made them jump through hoops. He created scenarios that forced them to reveal their character. From the outside, this looks cruel, but it's actually one of the most loving things Joseph could have done. Before reconciliation could happen, Joseph needed to know if his brothers were capable of genuine transformation. He needed to see if they had learned anything in the 13 years since they threw him in that pit. Ask yourself, is there someone in your life you've been rushing to reconcile with before you've tested whether they've genuinely changed? Real healing requires real transformation, not just apologies. And what Joseph discovers through his testing is going to reveal something profound about repentance. Lesson 19. Real repentance involves taking responsibility, not just feeling sorry. They said to one another, "Surely we are being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen. That's why this distress has come upon us." Reuben replied, "Didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy, but you wouldn't listen?" Genesis 42, verse 21-22. As Joseph tested his brothers, something shifted in them. They started connecting their current suffering to what they had done to Joseph all those years ago. They began talking about it among themselves, not knowing that Joseph could understand every word they were saying. And what Joseph heard was genuine remorse. His brothers weren't defending themselves. They weren't making excuses. They weren't blaming circumstances or spinning the narrative. They were acknowledging what they had done and accepting that their current crisis might be connected to their past cruelty. "We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen." They remembered his screams from the pit, they remembered his begging, and they finally, after 13 years, took responsibility for ignoring it. This is real repentance, not just saying you're sorry because you got caught, not just feeling bad about consequences, but genuinely understanding the impact of your actions and accepting the connection between what you did and what you're experiencing now. Joseph heard this, and something in him broke open. He realized his brothers had actually changed. They had grown. They had become men capable of acknowledging their wrongs and carrying the weight of their guilt. Real repentance isn't just words or emotions. It's a fundamental shift in how someone sees what they did and a willingness to accept full responsibility without deflection. Joseph is about to make a decision, but first, he has to do something he can't do in front of anyone. Lesson 20. Forgiveness requires you to face your pain alone before you can extend grace to others. He turned away from them and began to weep, but then turned back and spoke to them again. Genesis 42 verse 23 to 24. When Joseph heard his brother's genuine remorse, the weight of 13 years crashed into him all at once. He had to step away. He had to cry. He couldn't do it in front of them. The hurt, the betrayal, the years of separation from his father, the pit, the slavery, the false accusation, the prison, all of it came flooding back in that moment of hearing them finally acknowledge what they had done. Joseph had to face that pain alone before he could move toward reconciliation. This is the step most of us skip. We try to rush straight to forgiveness without allowing ourselves to feel the full weight of what was done to us. We think forgiveness means pretending the pain didn't happen or minimizing the wound. But real forgiveness isn't pretending. It's feeling the pain, acknowledging it, letting yourself grieve what was lost, and then, only then, choosing to forgive anyway. If Joseph had rushed straight to reconciliation without allowing himself to cry about what his brothers had cost him, the forgiveness would have been incomplete. It would have been a cover-up rather than genuine healing. If there's someone you need to forgive, give yourself permission to feel the pain first. Journal about what they cost you. Let yourself cry about what was lost. Then, from that place of honest grief, choose forgiveness, not because the pain didn't matter, but because your freedom matters more. Joseph emerges from his tears, ready to take the next step. But he's not done testing yet. There's one more scenario he needs to create. Joseph has the power to destroy his brothers. He has every right to demand retribution. But he's about to do something that will reveal what real strength looks like. If you've ever struggled with whether to forgive someone who hurt you deeply, what's coming next will show you what it looks like to live by principle instead of by impulse. Lesson 21. Vulnerability is the gateway to connection, not a sign of weakness. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, "Have everyone leave my presence." So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him. Genesis 45 verse 1 to 3. Joseph couldn't hold it together anymore. The testing was over. He had seen what he needed to see. His brothers had genuinely changed. Now he had to reveal himself. He sent everyone out of the room. Then he completely broke down. He wept so loudly that people in the palace heard him through the walls. This powerful administrator, this untouchable ruler, became fully human in front of the people who had hurt him most. His breakdown was his breakthrough. We think crying means we've failed. We think breaking down is a sign of weakness, especially if we're in positions of leadership or authority. But for Joseph, vulnerability was the gateway to real connection. His tears showed his brothers exactly what their abandonment had cost him. It made the pain real. It made him real. The mask came off, the administrator disappeared, and the wounded brother appeared. Don't be afraid to let people see your pain. Don't be afraid to show your vulnerability. That's where real connection happens. That's where actual healing begins. Strength isn't pretending you're unaffected. Strength is being honest about what affected you and choosing to move forward anyway. Now Joseph is about to say something that will reframe his entire story. Lesson 22. Your identity is rooted in your purpose, not in your pain. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you." Genesis 45 verse 4 to 5. Joseph revealed himself. But catch what he didn't do. He didn't say, "Look what you did to me." He didn't say, "I'm the victim of your cruelty." He didn't frame his entire story around what his brothers had done to him. Instead, he said, "God sent me ahead of you to save lives." Joseph's identity wasn't rooted in his trauma, it was rooted in his purpose. Yes, he had been sold into slavery. Yes, he had been imprisoned unjustly. Yes, he had been separated from his family for 13 years. All of that was real. All of that had happened. But it wasn't who Joseph was. Who Joseph was, at his core, was a man God had sent to save lives. That's the distinction that changes everything. So many of us define ourselves by our pain. We're the person who was betrayed. We're the person who was abandoned. We're the person who failed. And we carry that identity everywhere we go, into every room, into every relationship. But Joseph shows us something revolutionary. Yes, you experienced something difficult. Yes, you were hurt. But that's not your identity. That's just something that happened to you. Your identity is determined by your response and by the purpose God has given you. Ask yourself, how do you introduce yourself to yourself in your own mind? Is it rooted in your pain or in your purpose? What would shift if you changed that internal narrative? Joseph is about to say something even more radical. Lesson 23. Redemption requires seeing God's hand behind your painful circumstances. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God. Genesis 45, verse 7-8. This is the statement that transforms everything. Joseph looks at his brothers and reframes their betrayal entirely. He doesn't deny what they did. He doesn't minimize their cruelty. But he reframes who orchestrated it. It was not you who sent me here, but God. Joseph understood something most people never grasp. God can work through evil without being evil. His brothers acted with cruelty and selfishness. They made a wicked choice. But God took that wicked choice and repurposed it for a greater outcome. God sent Joseph to Egypt through the evil decision of his brothers. This doesn't make their choice right. It doesn't excuse their behavior, but it means their choice didn't have the final word. God did. This is faith at its highest level, not faith that God will prevent bad things from happening, but faith that God can redeem bad things after they happen. Faith that even when people betray you, even when circumstances seem designed to destroy you, God can be working behind the scenes to accomplish something greater than you can see. Identify the most painful circumstance in your life, the one you can't make sense of. Ask God to show you how He might be working through it, not just in spite of it. Write down what you sense Him revealing. Joseph's brothers are about to experience something they never expected from their betrayed brother. Lesson 24. True greatness is measured by your willingness to restore what others destroyed. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, "This is what your son Joseph says. God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me. Don't delay. You shall live in the region of Goshen and be near me. You, your children and grandchildren, your flocks and herds, and all you have. I will provide for you there." Genesis 45, verse 9-15. Joseph didn't just forgive his brothers. He provided for them. He didn't just let them buy grain and leave. He brought them into his household, moved his father to Egypt, gave them the best land in the region, and ensured they had complete provision and protection. Joseph used his position and resources to rebuild what his family had lost. He actively restored what had been broken. This is the definition of true greatness. Not revenge, not even just forgiveness, but actively working to repair and restore. Joseph had every reason to be bitter. He had every right to maintain distance, to say, "I forgive you, now leave and never come back." But instead, he moved toward his family with his full resources and his full heart. That takes more strength than any form of punishment ever could. Think about this practically. Joseph brought the family that betrayed him into the palace he earned through suffering. He gave them access to the influence he gained through faithfulness. He shared the blessing that came from his pain. Remember this: When you have the power to destroy someone, the true measure of your character is whether you use that power to restore them instead. That's the kind of strength that changes generational trajectories. But Joseph's brothers aren't fully convinced yet. Years later, they're going to test whether Joseph's forgiveness was real. Lesson 25. Real forgiveness is a permanent decision, not a temporary emotion. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?" So they sent word to Joseph, saying, "Your father left these instructions." Genesis 50 verse 15 to 17. After Jacob died, Joseph's brothers became terrified. They thought Joseph had only been kind to them because of their father. Now that Jacob was gone, they worried Joseph would finally take his revenge. So they fabricated a message, claiming Jacob had asked Joseph to forgive them. They threw themselves at his mercy. But catch this detail. Joseph had already made his decision about forgiveness years earlier. He had already chosen to restore his family. That choice was permanent. It wasn't dependent on external circumstances. It wasn't conditional on their father being alive. When his brothers came to him with their fear, Joseph didn't have to reconsider. He had already decided. This is what separates genuine forgiveness from temporary mercy. Temporary mercy says, "I'll forgive you as long as you behave a certain way." But genuine forgiveness makes a decision and sticks to it regardless of circumstances. Holding grudges requires constant vigilance. You have to keep rehearsing the offense, keep monitoring their behavior, keep tallying their failures. That's exhausting. Forgiveness requires one decision, made once, held permanently. Ask yourself, is there someone you've forgiven, but you keep taking that forgiveness back when they disappoint you? Make a permanent decision today. Forgive them once and for all, then stop monitoring their behavior to see if they deserve it. Joseph is about to make one final statement that will become one of the most quoted verses in all of Scripture. Lesson 26. What looks like a curse can actually be a gift when God is involved. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Genesis 50 verse 19 to 20. This is perhaps the most important statement in Joseph's entire story. Joseph acknowledges that his brothers intended harm. He doesn't minimize it. He doesn't pretend it wasn't real. He doesn't gaslight them by saying, "Oh, it wasn't that bad. You intended to harm me." Full acknowledgement of the evil that was done. But then he makes the leap that changes everything. But God intended it for good. Not that God caused them to harm Joseph, but that God took their harmful intention and repurposed it. God turned a curse into a gift. Joseph understood that the same circumstances that looked like abandonment and cruelty were actually the vehicle through which God was accomplishing deliverance. This is the principle that separates a child of God from someone who's just trying to survive. When you know God can redeem your pain, you stop needing revenge. When you know God can turn your curse into your gift, you stop needing justice from the people who hurt you. You can forgive them because you understand that your vindication doesn't depend on them being punished. Your breakthrough doesn't depend on them being held accountable. God's redemption is bigger than human justice. Stop asking God to punish the people who hurt you. Start asking God to redeem what they meant for harm. That's how you move from victim to overcomer. Joseph's life has come full circle. Now he's about to step into a legacy that extends far beyond anything he could have imagined. Lesson 27. God's purpose for your life is bigger than your personal comfort. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land, to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob." And Joseph made the Israelites swear an oath and said, "God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place." Genesis 50 verse 24 to 25. Even in his final days, Joseph wasn't thinking about himself. He was thinking about the future. He was thinking about his people. He was thinking about the promise God had made generations before he was born. Joseph understood that his life was part of a story that started before him and would continue long after him. He had been raised up, given authority, provided for his family, but none of that was the ultimate point. The ultimate point was the promise God made to Abraham that his descendants would inherit a specific land. Joseph knew Egypt wasn't home, so he made his descendants promise that when God brought them out of Egypt, and Joseph believed it would happen, they would take his bones with them. He wanted to be buried in the promised land, even if he'd never see it while alive. Joseph could have spent his last days enjoying his legacy, reveling in his comfort, celebrating his success. Instead, he spent them ensuring that his family never forgot who they were and where God was ultimately leading them. Ask yourself, are you living just for your own comfort and success, or are you living to prepare the next generation for their calling? What would shift if you saw your life as part of a multi-generational story? Joseph lived to 110 years old. He saw his great-great-grandchildren born, and when he died, he had accomplished something most people never achieve. He left a legacy that pointed beyond himself. Lesson 28. Faith isn't about understanding everything, it's about trusting anyway. The Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was with Joseph. Genesis 39, verse 2 and 21. This phrase echoes throughout Joseph's story like a drumbeat. The Lord was with Joseph in Potiphar's house. The Lord was with Joseph in prison. The Lord was with Joseph in the palace. But notice what's missing. Nowhere does it say Joseph understood why any of this was happening. He didn't understand why he was suffering in Potiphar's house. He didn't understand the connection between his pain and his purpose while he was rotting in prison. He didn't get a detailed explanation from God about the master plan. He just trusted that God was present even in the darkness. Faith isn't about having all the answers. Faith is about trusting that God knows what He's doing, even when you don't. Most of us wait for complete understanding before we trust. We want God to explain Himself first, show us the blueprint, give us the timeline, then we'll believe. But Joseph trusted first. He believed God was present and working even when he couldn't see it. He maintained his character even when it seemed pointless. He served faithfully even when no one important was watching. That's faith. Stop waiting for complete understanding before you trust God. Trust God in the dark. Trust Him in the confusion. Trust Him when it makes no sense. That's what separates faith from knowledge. Knowledge requires understanding. Faith requires trust. Lesson 29. Your private character is more important than your public performance. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, but the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. Genesis 39, verse 20 to 23. Even in prison, where no one important was watching, where there was no audience to impress, Joseph maintained his character. He worked hard, he was honest, he was faithful. He didn't do it for recognition. He didn't do it for reward. He did it because it was who he was. Anyone can perform well when they're being watched. Anyone can be honest when there are consequences to dishonesty. But to maintain your character, when you're forgotten, when you're invisible, when no one would ever know if you cut corners, that takes something deeper. That's when you prove to yourself and to God that your character isn't just a performance, it's your actual identity. The prison was Joseph's proving ground, not because God needed to see if Joseph was trustworthy, but because Joseph needed to discover who he was when stripped of everything external. In today's world, this is what you do when no one's tracking your metrics, how you treat people who can't do anything for you, what you watch when you're alone, how you handle money when no one's auditing you. That's your real character. Identify one area of your life where you've been cutting corners because no one will know. Bring the same level of integrity to that area that you bring to your most visible work. Watch what shifts internally. Lesson 30. The gifts God gives you are meant to serve others, not elevate yourself. I cannot do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. Genesis 41 verse 15 to 16. Joseph had a gift. He could interpret dreams, but he never once used that gift to build his own empire or to elevate his own status. He used it to help people in need. First, the cupbearer and baker in prison, then Pharaoh, ultimately millions of people during the famine. The gift wasn't about Joseph, it was about what the gift could accomplish through Joseph for other people. This is the shift that changes everything. What if we stopped thinking about our gifts in terms of what they can do for us? What if we reoriented completely and asked, how can my abilities serve others? How can my talents benefit people beyond myself? That shift moves you from building a career to fulfilling a calling. Joseph never saw his gift as his personal asset. He saw it as a tool God had given him to serve. And that perspective made him one of the most influential people in human history, not because he sought influence, but because he sought to serve. Ask yourself, what's the primary gift or talent you have? Are you using it primarily to advance yourself or to serve others? What would change if you reoriented it completely towards service? Lesson 31. Wisdom sees patterns, not just events. But 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. Genesis 41 verse 30 to 32. When Pharaoh had his troubling dream, the immediate response would have been panic. Something terrible is coming. React now. But Joseph didn't panic. He stepped back and saw the pattern. 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of famine. He understood the rhythm. He saw that the famine was inevitable, but that preparation during abundance could mitigate the devastation. Real wisdom isn't just reacting to crises, it's seeing patterns and preparing accordingly. We operate in constant crisis mode. Something bad happens and we scramble to respond. But wisdom says, let me step back and see the bigger pattern here. Let me understand what's coming and prepare now while I still can. This applies to everything: finances, health, relationships, career, spiritual life. There are patterns, seasons, rhythms. Wise people learn to read them and prepare accordingly. Look at your life over the past 3 to 5 years. What patterns do you see? What rhythm or cycle keeps repeating? What can you do now to prepare for the next iteration of that pattern? Lesson 32. Sometimes you need distance before you can have connection. As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he treated them as strangers and spoke harshly to them. Genesis 42 verse 7. Joseph didn't immediately welcome his brothers with open arms. He created distance. He tested them. He watched how they responded under pressure. This might seem harsh, but it was essential. Without that distance and testing, reconciliation would have been superficial. Joseph needed to know if his brothers had genuinely changed before he could risk vulnerability with them again. Real connection sometimes requires creating temporary distance first. You need to see who people are when they're uncomfortable. You need to see if they can take responsibility. You need to see if they're willing to change. This isn't about being vindictive. It's about being wise. Not everyone who says they've changed has actually changed. Not everyone who apologizes is genuinely repentant. Testing reveals truth. Ask yourself, is there a relationship you've been rushing to restore before you've tested whether genuine transformation has occurred? What would wise distance look like in that situation? Lesson 33. The greatest breakthroughs happen when you're willing to be vulnerable. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, so there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. Genesis 45 verse 2 to 3. Joseph's breakdown created the breakthrough. His brothers could never have connected with the powerful administrator, but they could connect with the vulnerable brother who wept with them. His tears were the bridge. His willingness to show his pain, his grief, his humanity. That's what made reconciliation possible. We think vulnerability is weakness. We think we need to stay strong, maintain our composure, keep the mask in place. But vulnerability is actually the gateway to real connection. When you let people see your pain, when you show them your struggle, when you admit that you've been broken by what happened, that's when actual healing becomes possible. The walls come down, the pretense disappears, and real human beings meet each other in honest brokenness. Don't be afraid to cry in front of the people who need to see that you're human. Your tears might be exactly what creates the bridge to connection. Lesson 34. Revenge feels justified until you experience the liberation of forgiveness. Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. Genesis 50 verse 19 to 20. Joseph had every right to punish his brothers. He had the power, the position, the authority, legal right, moral justification, cultural permission. But the moment of forgiveness was so powerful, so liberating for Joseph himself, that revenge would have been a step backward. Revenge feels justified in the moment. It feels like justice. It feels like what people deserve. But it's actually a chain that keeps you tied to your pain, tied to the person who hurt you, tied to the past. Forgiveness, on the other hand, is liberation. It releases you from the obligation to punish. It frees you to move forward without carrying the weight of someone else's debt. Joseph discovered something most people never experience. The power of forgiveness is greater than the satisfaction of revenge. Once you experience real forgiveness, the kind that sets you free, revenge starts to feel small and petty by comparison. If you're holding on to the right to punish someone, ask yourself, is this giving me freedom or keeping me in prison? Forgiveness isn't about them, it's about you choosing liberation over bondage. Lesson 35. Your legacy is written by how you treat people when you have power over them. God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, I will provide for you, so that you and your family and all who belong to you may not starve. Genesis 45 verse 9 to 11. Joseph used his power to provide, not to punish. He used his position to restore, not to retaliate. This is what's remembered about Joseph thousands of years later. Not his achievements, not his titles, not his wealth, but how he treated the people who had hurt him when he finally had the chance to hurt them back. Your legacy isn't what you accomplish. It's who you become and how you treat people when you hold power. A person can be incredibly successful, but leave a legacy of bitterness and pain if they use their power to crush others. But a person can be relatively ordinary and leave a legacy of blessing if they use whatever power they have to lift others up. Joseph chose blessing, that's why his name is still honored. Your legacy is being written right now through how you treat the people who have less power than you. Don't wait until you're important to start being kind. Be kind now with whatever power you have. That's the foundation of a legacy that lasts. Lesson 36. Trust that God's timing is better than your timing. When 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. Genesis 41 verse 1. Joseph waited in prison. He had interpreted the cupbearer's dream. He had asked to be remembered, but the cupbearer forgot him. For 2 full years, 730 days, 17,520 hours, 1,051,200 minutes of wondering if this was how his story ended. During that time, Joseph could have given up. He could have lost faith. He could have assumed God had abandoned him. But he waited. And exactly when God knew it was time, not a day sooner, not a day later, Pharaoh had a dream. The cupbearer suddenly remembered. The door opened. Joseph was summoned. Joseph's timing would have been immediate. He wanted out of prison the moment the cupbearer was released. But God's timing was better. God knew Joseph needed another 2 years of preparation. God knew the exact moment when Joseph was ready. And God knew the exact moment when Pharaoh would need him. Stop begging God to hurry up. Stop trying to force the door open before it's time. Trust that God knows exactly when to move, and that his timing is always better than what you would have chosen, even when the waiting feels unbearable. Lesson 37. The wilderness prepares you for the palace. Genesis 37 verse 50. Joseph's life had 3 major chapters. First, the favored son in his father's house. Second, the slave and prisoner in darkness. Third, the administrator in Pharaoh's palace. But catch this, Joseph couldn't have handled the palace without the wilderness. The 13 years of suffering, betrayal, and injustice weren't a detour from his destiny. They were the pathway to it. They shaped his character. They taught him humility. They taught him how to trust God when he had nothing else. They taught him how to lead with compassion instead of arrogance. They taught him how to steward power without abusing it. Without the wilderness, Joseph would have been a spoiled, entitled ruler, probably corrupt, definitely ineffective. But the wilderness refined him. It stripped away everything superficial and revealed what was real. Your wilderness isn't a mistake. It's not punishment. It's not evidence that God has forgotten you. It's preparation for something bigger than you can currently see. What if the difficult season you're in right now isn't God's rejection? What if it's God's preparation? How would that change how you engage with it? Lesson 38. Your influence multiplies when you point people to God instead of to yourself. Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. Genesis 41 verse 39. Pharaoh's evaluation of Joseph wasn't just about Joseph's intelligence or administrative skill. It was about something Pharaoh saw in Joseph that came from beyond Joseph, wisdom and discernment that originated with God. Joseph had consistently pointed people toward God instead of taking credit for himself. The interpretations weren't Joseph's, they were God's. The wisdom wasn't Joseph's, it was God's. And because Joseph was clear about that, Pharaoh didn't just trust Joseph's abilities, Pharaoh trusted Joseph's character. He trusted that Joseph would use his position to serve God, not to serve himself. That's why Pharaoh gave Joseph such enormous authority, not just because Joseph was smart, but because Joseph was aligned with something bigger than himself. When you point people toward God, your influence multiplies in ways that self-promotion never could. When you make it clear that your success flows from your connection to the source, people trust you more, not less. The next time someone compliments your work or asks for your advice, practice deflecting credit. I appreciate that, but honestly, I'm just trying to steward what God's given me. Watch how it shifts the conversation. Lesson 39. Real maturity is celebrating others' success without envy. Joseph lived 110 years and saw the third generation of Ephraim's children. Genesis 50 verse 23. Joseph lived long enough to see his children flourish, his grandchildren grow, and his great-grandchildren born. He didn't just have his own success, he celebrated the success of those around him. He didn't compete with his children. He didn't try to maintain power over them. He didn't resent when they stepped into their own authority and calling. He celebrated their growth. Real maturity isn't about accumulating power for yourself. It's about celebrating others stepping into their power. Most successful people struggle with this. They're threatened by the next generation. They try to maintain control. They resent when others start succeeding in their own right. But Joseph celebrated the flourishing of his descendants. That's real maturity. That's real strength. Ask yourself, who in your life is rising up, stepping into their calling, potentially even surpassing you? Can you celebrate that without feeling threatened? If not, what insecurity is driving the resistance? Lesson 40. Keeping your word even when it's inconvenient builds multi-generational trust. Joseph made the sons of Israel swear an oath and said, "When God comes to your aid, you must carry my bones up from this place." Genesis 50 verse 24 to 25. Joseph made his descendants promise something unusual. When they eventually left Egypt, they had to carry his bones with them back to the promised land. This was inconvenient, impractical. Joseph wouldn't be alive to enforce it, but he knew his descendants would keep their word. Why? Because he had been a man of his word his entire life. Centuries later, when Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt, guess what they brought with them? Joseph's bones. They kept the promise. Your word is more valuable than any contract. When you keep your commitments, even when it's inconvenient, even when no one's watching, even when it costs you something, people remember. And generations later, they honor those commitments because you've proven your integrity. Remember this: build a reputation for keeping your word in the small things. That's what creates trust in the big things. And that's what builds a legacy that lasts beyond your lifetime. Lesson 41. Don't let other people's fears become your reality. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us?" Genesis 50 verse 15 to 16. Joseph's brothers were afraid after Jacob died, but their fear didn't change Joseph's commitment to them. Joseph had already made his decision about forgiveness. He had already committed to providing for them. Their fear was about their own guilt, not about Joseph's actual intentions. But notice, Joseph didn't get angry at their fear. He didn't punish them for assuming the worst. He simply reassured them and reiterated what he had already promised. How often do we let other people's fears or doubts become our problem? We try to convince them of our commitment. We try to prove we're trustworthy. We get frustrated that they can't just believe us. But sometimes people's fears are so strong that no amount of proof will satisfy them immediately. That's their issue to work through, not yours to fix. You can stay steady in your commitment regardless of whether they believe it. Ask yourself, whose fear or doubt are you trying to manage right now? What would it look like to stay committed to your word without needing them to believe you immediately? Lesson 42. The meaning of your life is found in your response, not in your circumstances. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Genesis 50 verse 19 to 20. Joseph's life wasn't defined by what happened to him. It was defined by what he did with what happened to him. His brothers sold him into slavery, but Joseph didn't become a slave in his mind. He didn't adopt the identity of a victim. He didn't spend 13 years rehearsing his wounds and broadcasting his pain. He continued to believe, to work, to trust, and to grow. His slave traders didn't determine who Joseph was. His circumstances didn't determine who Joseph was. His response to his circumstances determined who Joseph was. This is the most liberating realization you can have. You can't always control what happens to you, but you can always control how you respond, and your response is what creates your actual life story. Joseph's story could have been a tragedy. Favored son becomes forgotten slave, dies in prison, the end. But Joseph's response turned it into a redemption narrative. His response transformed betrayal into breakthrough, suffering into salvation, a curse into a gift. Stop focusing on what happened to you. Start focusing on how you're responding to what happened. Write down one specific way you can respond with faith, integrity, or courage. This week, that response is where your power lies. That response is where your real story gets written. Lesson 43. Your destiny isn't about you. It's about who you become and what you prepare for others. Then Joseph said to his brothers, God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land, to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Genesis 50 verse 24 to 26. Joseph's entire life was preparing his family for something he wouldn't live to see. His story wasn't the culmination of God's plan. It was a chapter in a much larger narrative. Joseph understood that his job wasn't to complete the story. His job was to faithfully play his part so that the next generation could step into theirs. That's maturity. That's the mark of someone who truly understands their destiny. It's not about your personal achievement. It's not about your individual success. It's about the role you play in a story that's bigger than you, a story that started before you were born and will continue long after you're gone. You're a steward of something sacred, and your faithfulness in your chapter determines whether the next generation can step into theirs. Joseph saved his family from starvation, but more importantly, he preserved the line through which the Messiah would eventually come. He didn't know that. He couldn't see that far. But his faithfulness in his generation made it possible for future generations to fulfill their calling. Remember, you're not living just for yourself. You're not building just for your own comfort. You're living to prepare the way for the next generation. That perspective changes everything about how you make decisions, how you spend your time, how you invest your resources, and how you measure success. Your life is part of a multi-generational story. Play your part with faithfulness. That's all God asks. Joseph's story spans 40 years, compressed into 13 chapters of Genesis. But it's really a portrait of what it looks like to live with absolute faith in God when life is absolutely uncertain. From the pit to the palace, from slavery to leadership, from betrayal to reconciliation, from victim to deliverer. Joseph discovered something that transformed everything. God is working even when you can't see it. God is faithful even when people aren't. God is redeeming your pain even while you're still in the middle of it. If you're in a difficult season right now, if you've been betrayed, forgotten, or imprisoned by circumstances, Joseph's life is proof that this isn't the end of your story. It's the beginning of your transformation. The pit wasn't your punishment, it was your preparation. The betrayal wasn't random, it was the pathway to your purpose. The waiting wasn't wasted, it was refining you for something bigger than you can currently see. The very thing that feels like your greatest defeat might actually be your greatest setup for God's next move in your life. So here's what I want you to do before you close this video. First, tell me in the comments, if you could only apply one of these 43 lessons starting tomorrow morning, which would it be? Type the lesson number below. I'm personally betting most people will say either lesson 6, lesson 20, or lesson 26. Prove me wrong. Let's see what resonates most. Second, if this gave you a new perspective on your wilderness season, share it with someone who needs to hear it. That person who's been betrayed, that person who's waiting and wondering if God forgot them, that person who's doing the right thing and life is getting harder, not easier. Send them this video. Their breakthrough might be waiting in Joseph's story. Third, we're doing a deep dive into the life of David next, a man who faced his own giants, both literal and spiritual. A man who went from shepherd boy to king, from worship leader to warrior, from anointed to abandoned. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Because if Joseph's story showed you how to navigate betrayal, David's story is going to show you how to face your giants. And remember this one truth as you go back into your week. Your destiny isn't determined by your circumstances, it's determined by your response to them. The circumstances are God's job, the response is yours. Joseph chose faithfulness when everyone else would have chosen bitterness. He chose excellence when everyone else would have chosen minimum effort. He chose forgiveness when everyone else would have chosen revenge. He chose to see God's hand when everyone else would have seen only human cruelty. And that's why his name is still being spoken 4,000 years later. What will you choose? The pit or the palace, the victim or the victor, the curse or the gift? The choice has always been yours. Now go live like you believe it.